Why has capitalism gone woke? A look at the speed at which the corporate world has internalized the customs, practices, and languages of the university, and what can be done about it. Frank Furedi is a sociologist and social commentator. He is Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Kent in Canterbury. He is also Senior Research Fellow at the 21st Century Institute. His book, Invitation to Terror, Expanding the Empire of the Unknown, explores the way in which the threat of terrorism has become amplified through the ascendancy of precautionary thinking. Frank has also written extensively about issues to do with education and cultural life. His book, Wasted: Why Education is Not Educating, deals with the influence of the erosion of adult authority on schooling. On tolerance, he offers a restatement of the importance of this concept for an open society. Authority, a sociological history, examines how the modern world has become far more comfortable with questioning authority than with affirming it. Frank is committed to promoting the ideals of a humanist education, and his writings on higher education are devoted to affirming the value of the liberal arts. His latest book is titled Democracy Under Siege: Don't Let Them Lock It Down. Frank Furedi, welcome to our discussions. We look forward very much to what you have to say.
Thank you very much. The issue of woke capitalism, of the way in which corporations have identity politics, have embraced it, has been of tremendous interest to me. Because as many of you will know, people have been worried about developments in higher education and universities, and almost all the discussion on cancel culture has focused on what was going on campuses. But what people tended to overlook was that there were similar developments occurring at a much rapid rate in companies and corporations. And I think that one of the things that has really sort of surprised people, especially over the last year, is the way in which companies, especially the big corporations, the big tech corporations, the Silicon Valley outfits, have been in the forefront of cancel culture in the United States, but also are beginning to play a similar role within the United Kingdom. And in particular, I think that there's a very interesting development whereby these companies are coming together and self-consciously presenting themselves as a force for change, as a force for imposing new norms upon society. And this has been particularly important recently when about 150 companies held a Zoom meeting in the United States where they discussed how they could thwart laws that were passed by legislators in Georgia and Texas on voting, how they could prevent those laws from being implemented. And these companies have more or less decided that if they don't like a particular law, they will pull out their businesses from Georgia or North Carolina or from Texas and punish those states for being out of line. And I think when you think about this uninhibited way in which they're trying to cancel not just individual politicians, but try to cancel entire legislatures, then you can begin to realize that this becomes a very grave threat to democracy, potentially much graver than what's happening within the university sector. I think you have to remember that we now live in a world where woke capitalism is able to use Facebook and Twitter to censor the views of public figures they don't like. We now live in a world where Amazon can decide that books, particularly written by social conservatives, can just be casually banned. We live in a world where a lot of publishers are now talking about not publishing books written by people that somehow kind of come against the grain of woke culture. And when you have that, I think you have some very, very, very worrying developments. The one point that I think needs to be remembered is that all the developments associated with the Black Lives Movement have been legitimated by the speed with which all the different brands, the big corporate brands, went on side and insisted that Black Lives Matters was this sacred cause that they supported, but not only they supported, but had to be supported by everybody else. I've been looking at the development of this trend. I think it's possible to say that there are some distinct phases, because contrary to what people think, this has been a long time coming. The whole internalization of these values began in the 1970s. And in the 1970s, a lot of conservatives believed that business culture and business ideology would be strong enough to withstand the pressures that were coming from the 1960s counterculture. And I remember on numerous occasions when I gave speeches on this subject, a lot of people in the audience would say, well, you know, Frank, you don't realize there is nothing to worry about because business and also sports are able to withstand this kind of woke pressure. Now, we know that's not the case because the world of sports is taking the knee. And we also know that businesses are very enthusiastically taking the knee in an uninhibited kind of a way. But I think it's important to realize that this development was already in place in the 1970s when you had the beginning of a symbiosis between the cultural values, what I would call the old bourgeois cultural values of business, with the cultural themes of the new class, what was called stakeholder capitalism, where capitalism would no longer be about business, but would also be about values and about looking after the interests of all kinds of peoples within society. And the key role in this development was actually played by an institution called human resources, which we now take for granted, but which was relatively new in the 1970s, and also by the emergence of business consultants, because business consultants acted as a bridge between the university and the corporation. They kind of brought in those kinds of psychological and social values into business. In the 1990s, we have the first phase of this development, where you have the internalization of what was called in those days post-material boomer values. And these were values about well-being, about the environment, about sustainability, about social justice. That's the way they were kind of phrased, and they were fairly general in those days. They were not all that important, that businesses were talking more and more about this particular domain of social experience. Gradually, they also began to bring in health and safety, the environment, the policing of office politics, and a number of internal codes about diversity, harassment, and bullying. And I think this development was fairly muted until about the turn of the 21st century, where at that point in time, companies began to actively internalize identity politics and began to take the side more and more in the cultural war of the people that were on the identity side of the political struggle. Now, one reflection of this trend that things have changed dramatically in terms of how people perceive business and corporations is if you look at, for example, a survey that was carried out in the United States, and what that shows is there's a complete shift in attitude between Republicans and Democrats as far as business is concerned. So the share of Republicans who say they trust corporate America has fallen from 53% to 39% in just 1 year, while the Democrats, people who support the Democratic Party, are far more likely to trust business and say positive things about it. In sociology, we call this development that has occurred whereby business has internalized an ideology that was initially hostile to itself, cognitive contamination. And what that means is it's a process whereby ideals that were characterized as key to what was called adversary culture begins to gain hegemony over leading sections of the corporate world. Now, this process was first brought home to me at a very personal level in 2005, when I was asked to write an article on the infantilization of the workplace by the Harvard Business Review. And after I wrote this article for the Harvard Business Review, my editor told me, you know, Frank, people here in the Business Review don't think the way you do. And what he was really getting at was that if you went to Harvard University, if you went to Harvard Business School, the ideology was very much along the lines of what today is called woke ideology. And that had already become really quite important. And what you have is simply not simply the transformation of business culture, but also business people. And I think this is very, very important, because if you look at the leading CEOs of the corporate world, you will find that they have fully embraced this kind of celebrity culture, this identity culture, where they personify many of these regressive trends that no doubt we've been discussing all day. If you look at people like Bill Gates of Microsoft, of Tim Cook of Apple, of Larry Fink of BlackRock, or Bank of America's Brian Moynihan. So what you've got with these new executives are corporation leaders that are very different from the old type of Protestant ethic influenced capitalists. Their whole image, what the kind of personality they project, is one that has got an ambition to be taken seriously as a political player, as a social justice warrior. And that is something, that's the kind of ideal that they live by. If you talk to them and you watch them on television, they revel in their status as cultural celebrities. And in particular, they are really delighted in demonstrating a degree of irrelevance and hatred towards society's traditions. So that when you listen to the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs or the guys involved in new startups in London, they continually flaunt their commitment to being edgy and breaking taboos. And this sentiment is particularly highlighted in advertising and in public relations, where the brands that they promote all wear their social justice commitment on their sleeves, and they continually project the image of a taboo breaker. So they're very much in the business of creating new norms, new ideals. And I think it's important to take a step back and ask the question, well, what's really going on? Because a lot of people, especially on the conservative side, tend to believe that these new entrepreneurs are just playing a game, that these companies who are promoting Black Lives Matter are only doing it in order to gain popularity. They don't really mean their wokeness. This is something that they're just using instrumentally in order to make money. And I think that fundamentally overlooks the fact that when you look at the situation more closely, you realize that most of these executives actually believe in what they are saying. I think it's very much the case that CEOs who are taking the knee today are the products of a system of education and of higher education, which was hospitable to identity politics and which was always hostile to traditional conservative and even of classical liberal values. In effect, through their school and education, many of these today's CEOs have been socialized into norms that underpin cancel culture. Now, sociological research suggests that it usually takes about 3 generations for new values, especially those that are opposed to the prevailing norms, to gain hegemony. And I think that that's something that has not come into fruition. I think it's important to realize that although this has been a long time coming, it's only now that woke capitalism has become really institutionalized. It's only now that it's acquired a sort of great important form. The most important development in relation to this is the business school. It's the people getting the MBAs. And I know myself, having taught on several MBA courses, that a typical business school today, especially the Ivy League type business schools, the leading edge business schools, are almost indistinguishable from a university social science department. Their values and their outlook on the world is pretty much sort of coextensive with what sociologists or psychologists teach in the social sciences. But what has changed and what has given this kind of ideology the character of a living force is the arrival of millennial recruits within corporation. Because if you look at the role that the millennial executives play, these are the ones that are in the mid-30s and early 40s. they are very much in the forefront of insisting that corporations play an active social and political role. They're the ones that are insisting that the distinction between work life and home life should be coterminous, that there shouldn't be a clear distinction between their private and their public life. They are very much looking upon businesses and corporations as safe spaces for their identity play. And in that sense, they are always able to put pressure on the executives. A very good example of this was brought home to me recently in the discussion that's occurred in the publishing industry, where the young members or the middle management of a company like Hachette, which is one of the largest publishing companies in Europe, was under pressure from these younger executives not to publish the Harry Potter books or the J.K. Rowling books on the grounds of views on trans culture. And I thought it was very, very interesting that a couple of weeks later, after this revolt occurred in Hachette, a number of leading publishers spoke to the House of Lords in Britain, and they explained that we now live in a world where we have to teach the new recruits to publishing that sometimes they will have to work on books written by people that they don't like. So just stop for a second. The publishing world, which used to be one of the most open, tolerant industries, is now worried about the fact that the millennials and the younger generations coming in are not, they have to be convinced that they have to work on books written by authors they don't like, right, rather than just simply canceling them. And the very fact that publishing executives are thinking about this, how to kind of reconcile their vocation as publishers with this impulse towards canceling sort of people that are their adversaries, illustrates the trends that are, I think, very, very important today. Now, some conservatives in the United States have realized what's happening. They finally realized that the problem is quite serious and far more dangerous than what happened in the universities. And what they have counseled and what they have argued for is that they need to mobilize shareholder power against woke business leaders. And there are campaigns going on to get shareholders to somehow sort of put a stop to this development. Myself, I don't think that strategy will work. I think that it will not work for the very simple reason that the largest shareholders are owned by trusts and companies who are run by companies like BlackRock, who are themselves totally committed to these kinds of values. And I don't think the idea of mobilizing shareholders is going to get very much traction other than gain a few headlines in newspapers. It seems to me that the only way that this development can be contained or challenged, and it's a very big ask, is essentially through a populist message where you're trying to get people in society to understand that business has got to be held to account. They have to be depoliticized and they have to be pushed out of politics so that they go back to their original role as just being economic players rather than as political warriors. And to that extent, I think it's the people and it's the democratic process that's got to be somehow harnessed to this project in order to ensure that this new development within business does not expand any further and encompass the whole of public life. Thank you.
Frank, thank you very much indeed. I'm joined by Ryszard Legutko. I'll begin by asking a question about the legal situation of corporations, because it seems to me one obstacle to the takeover by the woke capitalists within a corporation is the legal obligation of that company to make a profit for its shareholders. And that, in effect, reduces the degree of control, not massively perhaps, but still it reduces the degree of control which the managers who you're talking about can exercise in the direction of the company. Do you think that legal obligation is going to survive? Because stakeholder capitalism, in effect, says that legal obligation will be replaced by a kind of obligation to multiple stakeholders.
Well, I think that what you say would have been the case in the 1970s and the early 80s. But gradually, what you have is a growing redefinition of the role of a corporation. And if you look at the legal scholarship on this particular subject, there's a large number of legal scholars who are committed to changing corporate law, and in conjunction with the support they're getting from sections of business, and particularly from the business schools, they are gradually eroding that particular obligation. So that you now have a situation where, for example, you have a large number of CEOs who are saying, if you don't like what we're doing, don't buy our shares. If you don't like what we're doing, don't buy our products, because they know that they are in a relatively strong position. And although the law at the moment is only in the process of becoming different and becoming much more hospitable to woke corporate ideals, the trend is very much in that direction. And so what I'm really worried about is that the legal framework within which corporations operate is going to become much more devoted to the state, what's called the stakeholder, at the expense of the shareholder.
But won't that actually produce a divide between the corporate managements of corporations and the corporate managers of the pension funds and large mass shareholder organizations, which after all have to provide funds for their pensions?
I think that there is that tension. And if you look at most surveys that have been carried out by Fortune and other organizations, there seems to be a division, a 50-50 division between different corporate heads on this particular subject. But the interesting thing is that these divisions also are found within the pension fund area industry, where there are a lot of pension providers who have now reinvented themselves as having ethical funds, what they call ethical funds, and have reinvented themselves as making sure that their funds are in alignment with sustainability values, with the values of diversity. So kind of gradually what you're getting is a kind of move away from the pensioner providing good pensions, a move away from the shareholder towards something that's much more nebulous. And a lot of the argument that's being put forward is that actually being woke is not bad for business. Being woke is going to make profits for you. And this argument is almost put forward on such a regular basis within the business school domain that people actually believe that unless they jump on this particular bandwagon, they're going to lose out in terms of their competitive edge.
That was most interesting. But if you look at the history of capitalism, I think you would see that every time the business people, the capitalism tended to adapt themselves to the powers that be. I mean, where there was a bourgeois society, the business people were the Buddenbrooks and the Forsyths. In Prussia, they were patriotic Prussians. In German National Socialism, they were the Hitlerites. Had there been capitalism in the Soviet Union, I think they would have been exemplary Stalinists. Don't you think that if the situation changes, if you make a thought experiment, right? All of a sudden in the United States, there is a powerful conservative power structure. Don't you think that the capitalists would, or the majority of them would say, to hell with ideology? I mean, that's where the money is. And from now on, let us forget about our wokeism. We are good conservatives.
Well, I think in principle, you're right, that capitalism has always been very flexible, very adaptable over the decades. But I do think that there is something interesting going on. I think that the most interesting thing is that the most wokish companies are the ones that are in the leading edge, the most profitable sector of the capitalist economy. These are the big tech companies, the big media companies, the big banks, providers of financial services, they're the ones that have really moved in that direction in the most wholehearted way. And some of the old industries, like mining, for example, sort of have been kind of left behind or have more or less stayed still. So I think that there's that development. The other development, of course, is that at the moment, the prospects of conservatism are relatively weak, because I think conservatism lacks a commanding appeal. It lacks a sustainable intellectual coherence, which is why I think this kind of conference, what we're having, is really sort of quite important. So that at the moment, the way that I look at it is that at the moment there is no danger for these people that conservatism is going to flourish. Because what's interesting is that even under the Trump administration, these developments accelerated. So you had, on the one hand, the election of Donald Trump, but at the same time, alongside of it, you had the flourishing, the unprecedented flourishing of woke capitalism. And I would argue, this is something that an argument that I'm developing, that these trends have strengthened precisely because they had something to react against, which was Trump. These trends developed in Europe because they had something to react against, which was Brexit and which was populism. And in many ways, these new capitalists are a product of a struggle, or at least a reaction against trends which they've learned are against their own interests. So you do have a very interesting trend developing, and I'm completely open to the idea that capitalism will change, as it always has changed. But what I am worried about is that this what you have is not just simply these developments in corporate capitalism, but the coming together of three important institutions, or four important institutions: corporations, higher education, the university, the media, big media, and the public sector. And when these four institutions converge in the way they do in many, many parts of the Western world, I think that's a very powerful block that we need to think about how we can challenge effectively.
Frank, I think you've opened up enormous vistas for future conferences, because I think some of the same analysis we've just heard could also be applied to areas such as science, which is also coming under the same kind of attack, a critique and attack. So I'd like to thank you very warmly. We look forward to seeing you soon, and thank you for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you.